The operations tent was packed with Marines seated on benches, waiting for the pre-deployment briefing. The platoon commander, Lieutenant Hayes, stood at the front with a map of Afghanistan spread across the table. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan sat in the back row, notebook open, pen ready, 52 years old, the oldest man in the room by 3 decades. Hayes began the brief, outlining the mission, the terrain, the threats, standard protocol. The young Marines listened with a mix of focus and nervous energy. Most of them had never deployed before. Halfway through, Hayes paused and gestured toward the map. "Any questions?" A corporal in the front raised his hand. "Sir, what about the tribal dynamics? The brief says we're working with local forces, but it doesn't say which tribes." Hayes hesitated. "That's still being coordinated by hire." From the back, Brennan's quiet voice cut through. "Pashtun, most likely. That region's primarily Durrani lineage. They don't trust outsiders easily, but they respect age and patience. Whoever's doing liaison work needs to understand that." The room turned. Every head swiveled toward the older Marine, who'd just spoken with the kind of knowledge that didn't come from a PowerPoint. Hayes blinked. "You've been there before, Brennan." Brennan nodded once, twice. "Different war, same ground." Silence, the kind that comes when assumptions start cracking. "Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Havoy so you never miss these true tales of courage, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?" Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan had left the Marine Corps 15 years earlier. Honorable discharge to tours in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, a career that had left him with scars, memories, and a deep understanding of what war actually cost. He had gone home to Texas, married, raised 2 daughters, worked construction, lived the quiet life that veterans dream about when they're still in the fight. But in the spring of 2021, something changed. He watched the news, saw young Marines deploying to places he remembered, heard the rhetoric, felt the weight of knowing what those kids were walking into. His wife, Sarah, found him one night sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his old dress blues hanging in the back of the closet. "You're thinking about it," she said. Not a question, a statement. Brennan looked up. "They're sending kids who've never seen combat. Some of them just turned 19. And you think you can help?" He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "I think I have to try." Sarah sat down across from him. She didn't argue. She knew her husband, knew that some men carry the weight of service their entire lives, and that weight never really lifts. 3 weeks later, Brennan walked into a recruiting office in San Antonio. The recruiter, a gunnery sergeant half his age, looked at his birth date on the form and raised an eyebrow. "You know we'll need an age waiver, right?" "I know. And you're willing to go through the physical again?" At 52, Brennan met his eyes. "I've been running 5 miles a day for 30 years. I'll pass." The waiver took 2 months. Letters of recommendation from former commanders, medical evaluations, psychological screenings. The Corps didn't make it easy, but in August, the approval came through. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan was back in when he reported to Camp Pendleton for integration. With 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, the reaction was immediate. The platoon was young, average age 22. Most of them had joined after high school, drawn by adventure, patriotism, or the promise of college money. They were fit, eager, and convinced they were ready for whatever came next. Then Brennan walked into the barracks, 52 years old, gray hair, lines around his eyes that came from decades of looking into the sun. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who learned not to waste energy. The lance corporal nearest the door did a double take. "Sergeant, I think you're in the wrong building." Brennan set his duffel on the empty rack. "2nd Platoon, Alpha Company." "Yeah, but then I'm in the right place." Silence spread through the barracks. 30 young faces turned toward the older man unpacking his gear with calm precision. From the back of the room, someone whispered, "No way. They're deploying, Grandpa?" Quiet laughter. Not malicious, just disbelief. Brennan didn't react. He'd been through this before. Respect wasn't given on day one. It was earned. But what these young Marines didn't understand yet was that the man they were laughing at had already lived the war they were about to enter. And he'd come back to make sure as many of them as possible survived it. The first few weeks were hard, not physically. Brennan kept up with the platoon in every training evolution. He passed the combat fitness test. He qualified expert on the rifle range. His body, though older, was still capable. but the social distance was harder to bridge. In the chow hall, Brennan sat alone, not because he was rejected outright, but because the young Marines didn't know how to talk to him. He was older than most of their fathers. He didn't understand their jokes, didn't listen to their music, didn't share their references. He became a ghost in the formation, present but separate. During a night training evolution, Corporal Jason Reeves sat with a group of Marines around a small fire, cleaning weapons and trading stories. "You think they're seriously deploying Brennan with us?" one asked. Reeves shrugged. "Guess so. Dude's got the quills." "Yeah, but come on. He's 52. What happens if we're in contact and he can't keep up? What if we have to carry him out?" Another Marine chimed in. "My dad's 52. He gets winded walking upstairs. No offense to Brennan, but this isn't a job for someone his age." Reeves didn't disagree, but he also didn't pile on. Something about Brennan unsettled him. The way the older man moved, the way he watched, like he was always 3 steps ahead, seeing things the rest of them missed. Later that night, Reeves found Brennan sitting alone outside the barracks, cleaning his rifle under a dim light. "Sergeant," Reeves said, hesitant. Brennan looked up. "Reeves, can I ask you something?" Brennan nodded. "Why'd you come back? You already did your time. You could be home with your family." Brennan set down the rifle and looked at the younger Marine for a long moment. "Because I know what's waiting for you over there," he said quietly, "and I know how easy it is to lose yourself in it, how the fear gets inside your head, how the choices you make stay with you for the rest of your life." He paused. "You're all good Marines, strong, fast, well-trained. But training doesn't prepare you for the moment when someone you know stops breathing, or when you have to decide whether to pull the trigger on someone who might not be a threat, or when you come back and realize the person you were before is gone." Reeves said nothing. "I'm not here to fight," Brennan continued. "I'm here to make sure you all make it home. And if that means being the old guy everyone laughs at, I'm fine with that." Reeves walked away that night thinking about what Brennan had said, but he didn't share it with the others, and the distance remained. In September, the battalion deployed to Helmand Province, Forward Operating Base Jackson, a dusty outpost surrounded by mountains, villages, and an enemy that knew the terrain better than any map could show. The platoon settled into the rhythm of deployment, patrols, guard duty, boredom punctuated by brief moments of violence. Brennan kept to himself. He didn't push into the social circle, didn't try to be one of the guys. He just did his job, carried his weight, kept his head down. But the young Marines noticed things. Brennan never complained, not about the heat, the food, the long shifts. He never showed frustration when things went wrong. He just adapted. When a sandstorm hit and knocked out communications for 12 hours, Brennan calmly pulled out a paper map and started plotting alternate extraction points. While others panicked, he worked. When a lance corporal's rifle jammed during a patrol, Brennan fixed it in 30 seconds without a word. Just handed it back and kept moving. Small things. Quiet competence. The kind that didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. Then came the night everything changed. The platoon was 3 weeks into the deployment. A routine patrol had turned into a 6-hour firefight. They made it back to base, but the adrenaline was still coursing through their veins. Lance Corporal Danny Price sat outside the barracks, hands shaking, unable to stop replaying the moment when a bullet had passed inches from his head. He was 19 years old. It was his first real combat. Brennan found him there, sitting alone in the dark. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside him. Price's voice was tight. "I thought I was gonna die today." Brennan nodded. "Probably felt like it. Does it ever stop? The shaking?" Eventually, Price looked at him. "When?" Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you stop fighting it. The fear doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it." Price's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can do this." Brennan's voice was steady, calm. "You already did. You made it back. That's what counts. But what if next time? Next time, you'll do it again. One step at a time. One breath at a time. That's all any of us can do." They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Price spoke again, quieter now. "Thank you, Sergeant." Brennan just nodded. Word spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, Marine to Marine. Brennan became the person they went to when the weight got too heavy, when they needed someone who understood, who didn't judge, who just listened. 2 months into the deployment, the platoon hit a breaking point. A patrol had been ambushed. 2 Marines wounded. 1 seriously. The medevac had taken too long. The entire platoon watched as their brother was loaded onto the helicopter, blood soaking through the bandages. Eyes wide with fear. He survived, but the incident cracked something in the unit. Morale collapsed. Tempers flared. Marines snapped at each other over nothing. The stress, the fear, the exhaustion had all built up until the platoon felt like it was one bad day away from falling apart. Lieutenant Hayes called a formation, tried to rally them, gave the speech about mission, duty, honor. The words sounded hollow. Afterward, Corporal Reeves found Brennan sitting alone near the perimeter, looking out at the mountains. "We're falling apart," Reeves said bluntly. Brennan didn't look at him. "I know. So what do we do?" Brennan was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up. "Gather the platoon. Tonight, after chow." That evening, 30 Marines sat in a circle outside the barracks. No officers, no structure, just the platoon. Brennan stood in the center. He didn't give a speech. He didn't try to inspire them with grand words. He just told them a story about Iraq, about a patrol that went wrong, about a young Marine named Carter who'd frozen under fire and thought he'd never be able to face his squad again. "I found him that night," Brennan said, "sitting by himself, convinced he was a coward, convinced he'd let everyone down." The platoon listened in silence. "I told him the same thing I'll tell you. Fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you human, and the only way through it is together." He looked around the circle. "You're scared. You should be. This place is dangerous. But you're not alone. Every man in this circle is carrying the same weight, and we're going to carry it together. No one gets left behind. Not on patrol. Not in your head." His voice was steady, certain. "We're going to make it home. All of us. But only if we stop pretending we're not afraid and start admitting that we are. That's not weakness. That's strength." The silence that followed was different. Not empty. Full. Slowly, one by one, Marines started talking, sharing, admitting things they'd been holding inside. And Brennan just listened. By the end of the night, something had shifted. The platoon wasn't fixed, but it was holding together. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to say the quiet part out loud. The deployment lasted 7 months. There were more firefights, more close calls, more nights when the fear threatened to swallow them whole, but the platoon held. And at the center of it, quiet and steady, was Michael Brennan. He never raised his voice, never demanded respect. He just showed up every day, every hard moment, every time someone needed an anchor. By the end, the jokes had stopped. The whispers about his age disappeared. The young Marines no longer saw him as the old guy who didn't belong. They saw him as the reason they were still sane. When the platoon finally rotated home, Lieutenant Hayes pulled Brennan aside before they boarded the transport. "I owe you an apology, Brennan." Brennan shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, sir." "Yes, I do. I didn't think you'd fit. Thought you'd be a liability." Hayes' voice was thick. "But you held this platoon together when I couldn't." Brennan's expression softened. "That's not true. You led them through hell. I just reminded them they weren't walking through it alone." Hayes extended his hand. "Thank you." Brennan shook it. On the flight home, Corporal Reeves sat beside Brennan. They didn't talk much, just sat in the comfortable silence of men who'd been through something together. Finally, Reeves spoke. "You know, when you first showed up, I thought you were crazy. Coming back at your age." Brennan smiled faintly. "Maybe I was." "No." Reeves shook his head. "You knew something we didn't. You knew we'd need you." Brennan looked out the window at the clouds passing below. "Everyone needs someone who's been through it before," he said quietly. "Someone who can tell them it's going to be okay, even when it doesn't feel like it." Reeves nodded. Then, after a pause, "My dad's 52. I'm going to call him when we land. Tell him I get it now." Brennan glanced at him. "Get what?" "Why guys like you come back. It's not about the fight. It's about the people." Brennan didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and let the hum of the engines carry him home. Michael Brennan returned to Texas after the deployment, back to his wife, his daughters, his quiet life. The Marines he served with stayed in touch, not all of them, but enough. And when they struggled, when the memories got too heavy, they called, because they knew he'd answer. He never talked about what he did over there, never claimed to be a hero. He just showed up when his country asked. And he reminded a group of young men that strength isn't about age, speed, or firepower. It's about being present when others need you most. Moral: true leadership isn't loud. Sometimes the strongest warrior is the one who's already fought the hardest battle and came back to help others through theirs. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Hevoy for more military and veteran stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor, stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.